Hello there. How's it going? Got another topic I want to talk to you about, and this is going to be a little bit of information about the human immune system. So we've kind of touched on a couple of these things a little bit. I think it would be useful and interesting for us to kind of get a few more details about your immune system. The caveat being, I'm not a medical doctor, right? I'm a fish guy, okay? So this is not something that I'm an expert in. I do have a PhD in zoology, and so I have learned about this in some of my classes, and it's really fascinating and interesting, but understand it's also really complicated. And so, I don't understand this as well as your doctor or somebody who studies this, okay? But that's fine, because what we're doing is we're taking what's called the 10,000 foot view. We just want an overview of things, and I wanted to introduce the parts of the immune system that I thought were important for you, as a human being who's going to get sick, to understand. So anyway, let's get to work. And so these are the topics I'm going to break it down into over a couple of lectures. And like I said, the human immune system is really complicated, and there's a lot going on there. And this is definitely just an intro and an overview of the immune system. We have entire semester-long classes that are just on the immune system. So there's a lot that can be studied here, and there's a lot going on. However, that's not going to preclude us from being able to get some basics and to really get a better idea of what's going on in your body when you get sick. It's very powerful, and so it works very well. And my argument being, most of us aren't sick all the time, but we're constantly bombarded with things that can make us sick. And so just from that basic information there lets you know, hey, this is a fairly powerful system. And again, why do I think it's important to talk about it in this class? I mean, this is something that binds all of us. Disease and medicine, every one of us has to deal with this. This is something that we all need to understand. And so the more you know, the better you can understand your health care, and hopefully the better you can, the higher the quality of your life. So this is certainly something that impacts all of us. So let's start talking about the things that might make you sick. And as I mentioned, one of the things that to me is amazing about the immune system is the fact that most of us aren't sick all the time. You get sick and there are days you don't feel good, but there is an unbelievable number of parasites crawling all over your body and in your body. You are just constantly bombarded with these things. And they, for the most part, don't make you too sick. But let's talk about parasites and what is parasitism. And so there are lots of ways we can classify interactions between two different species. And parasitism is a close interaction between two species in which one is harmed and one benefits. Okay? And when we talk about harm and benefit, ultimately we're talking about fitness. One species the fitness goes up, and one species the fitness goes down. But an even simpler way to put it is one is harmed and one is benefited, when one benefits. So the one that's harmed is the host, the one that benefits is the parasite. Now, we can contrast that, like I said, there's lots of ways you can categorize interactions between species. And so parasitism is not like predation. In predation, you could say, hey, here too, one species benefits and one species loses out. But in predation, or in a predator-prey relationship, the loser is killed. Whereas in a parasitic relationship, the host is not killed, they're just harmed in some way. And so that's a very important difference. And in fact, for many parasites, the argument is made that the parasite doesn't want to kill its host. because the parasite needs its host to reproduce, and the parasite needs its host to help spread it around to other hosts. And so if the parasite is too virulent and kills its host too quickly, well, that's bad for the parasite. So the parasite doesn't necessarily want to kill you. In a predator-prey relationship, the predator is going to kill the prey and eat the prey. Now, parasitism is also interesting because it's probably the most common way of life, or most common life strategy on Earth. And so if you took all the species, all the animal species, and even plant species, and fungi, there's all kinds of parasites. They don't have to be animals or plants. It can be fungi or bacteria. Anyway, if you looked at all the organisms and their major mode of living, most of them would be parasites. And you know, an organism is not necessarily always just a parasite. You know, there could be a parasite in this relationship and a predator in this relationship and so on. But in general, if you looked at the mode of action of most species, it's going to be a parasite. It's a pretty good strategy for a species, you know, to stick around. Like I said, there's tons of parasites of humans. And it's these parasites that, you know, by definition sort of harm us and cause infection and make us sick. And so that's what your immune system is responding to. And so, you know, this is not coming out of your textbook. This is coming out of, you know, an online textbook that I've sent you the link for. And here's some examples of the different types of parasites that you're going to get in humans. Excuse me, different kinds of things that can make you sick. And so, for example, bacteria can cause a lot of diseases, pneumonia, strep throat, staph infections, and MRSA, and food poisoning. Those are all bacterial infections. We've talked about viruses, right? Viruses aren't really considered to be alive, but yet they're still parasitic, and they still cause lots of diseases, right? Colds and flus and AIDS and smallpox, and of course COVID now. Fungi can also parasitize humans. You know, athlete's foot or ringworm. These are fungal infections, and in fact, I think you know, medical mycology and fungal disease is something that is starting to be studied a lot more, because there's a lot of diseases that originally maybe were thought to be bacterial in origin, but they find out now that's actually a fungus. And well, that makes, you know, it's very important to know what's causing the disease so you can treat it properly. And then also the chart here lists protozoans, which are single-celled organisms that are you know, sometimes difficult to classify, and they're not always necessarily related to one another, but they're small single-celled organisms that are eukaryotic versus the bacteria, which are prokaryotic. And the protozoans are things like Giardia, or malaria is caused by a protozoan. So again, it's a parasite of humans that makes you sick. And so different parasites affect you in different ways because they're different organisms. They have different ways of attacking you. They have different types of defenses. They all have their own evolutionary history. And so, for example, you're familiar with antibiotics. Antibiotics are designed to work against bacteria, but they don't really do anything for viruses. And so, you know, a lot of times your doctor may give you an antibiotic, and it's sort of a prophylactic. It's sort of to make sure you don't get a bacterial infection. But antibiotics are not medicines designed to cure you of viruses. Now, there are antiviral medicines, and they're becoming more common. But, you know, a bacterium and a virus and a fungus and a protozoan, they're all very different organisms, and so they require different treatments. Figuring out the source of the infection and then the proper treatment, that's really difficult. That's very complicated. That's why people go to med school, right? That's why we need people in med school. We need people to go and get an undergraduate degree and then go spend 4 more years in med school, and then 2 or 3 more years in residency, and then a lifetime of learning new techniques. Medicine is complicated because of this, because it's not always easy to know what is infecting the patient, and then to know exactly how to treat it. And of course, there's a whole lot of other diseases that we're not even touching on, like genetic diseases. Those don't have anything to do with a parasite, but they're also disorders and diseases. So what we're just talking about is the stuff that the parasites that your immune system can attack. But anyway, as I said, this is something that's going to influence all of us. It's going to affect all of us. And so it's something that we need to support. And we need to make it, we need more people in school. We need more people going to med school. We need more people studying these things and learning how to treat them, because that benefits all of us. We need to make it easier for people to do this. We're making it harder for people to go to school. We're making it more expensive. That's the opposite direction. This kind of stuff benefits all of us, and so we should make it easier for people to get into med school or any kind of school. That's my opinion. Anyway, so when these parasites or an organism makes you sick, we call it a pathogen, all right? And commonly these pathogens are called germs. And so germ is not a really good biologic term, but it's a term you're familiar with. You're always talking about germs, and we got to clean up the germs. Germs is sort of just a general term for pathogen, and so that could be a virus or a bacteria or a fungus or a protozoan, right? Now the pathogens, because they're small and they're parasites and their whole evolutionary history has made them very good at what they do, they reproduce very rapidly in your body. And so if they get in your body and they're left unchecked, they can reproduce quickly, and you can get a huge amount of them, and of course that's what makes you sick. Now your immune system tries to recognize the pathogen and then remove it. And so the immune system has to determine, hey, this thing, there's something here in the body that doesn't belong here, and we need to get rid of it. And if the pathogen is recognized and removed quickly, then you often don't know it's there. And that's what I'm talking about. Like you're right now, you got all kinds of stuff in your body, but it's probably not affecting you because your immune system is removing them before they can multiply, before they can make a big deal. But if every once in a while one of those pathogens slips past your immune system and then multiplies, and then that makes you sick. The presence of the pathogen makes you sick, and then also your immune system response to it also makes you feel bad. Okay. Now we briefly touched upon the lymphatic system before, but it's really important to the immune system, so let's talk about it in just a little bit more detail, all right? Now, the lymphatic system is not the only part of the immune system. There's lots of things that are all coordinated to help with your immunity. So, probably one of the best organs for protecting you is your skin. Your skin tends to be dry and not a good place for bacteria to grow, and it's tough and it's thick, and it's a really good barrier for keeping things out. Mucus and tears, those are things that are designed to trap pathogens before they get into your body, and then you expel them. Stomach acid, you're constantly taking things from the environment that's just covered in pathogens and putting it right into your body, right? But the first thing it hits is this very acidic environment, which helps to protect you against those pathogens. So there's lots of things like that. You maybe have heard of white blood cells. Those are also called leukocytes. And there's lots of different types of white blood cells. And so we're not going to get into too much detail about these. But white blood cells are very important for your immune response. And the white blood cells, a lot of them are found in the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system plays a big part in your immunity. And so, the figure on the left I've already showed you. The figure on the right is a different one too. And so the lymphatic system has a few main organs: your tonsils, the thymus, which is here in your chest, and the spleen. Those are the major organs. Also, you could probably consider bone marrow might be considered part of the lymphatic system too. And then you've got lots of vessels that carry lymph around your body. And then something we've talked about before, along those vessels, you've got hundreds of lymph nodes spread all throughout your body. And so this is all part of the lymphatic system. And it's a lot like the circulatory system. You've got a liquid that's being carried around the body in vessels, just like, blood gets carried around the body in blood vessels. Lymph gets carried in the lymphatic system, not blood. One thing that's unique is that the lymph only goes in sort of one direction. And so the lymph gets collected everywhere in your body, and then it all moves up to your chest, and then it gets returned to the blood. Whereas, blood circulates constantly through your body, and it goes, to your lungs and back to your heart, and then to your body and back to your heart, and it's constantly being circulated. The lymph just sort of gets collected and then moves back to the circulatory system. And whereas your circulatory system, you've got this heart, this very muscular pump that pushes the blood all over the body. You don't have such a thing in the lymphatic system. You've got vessels, and the vessels have, they're little muscles, and the vessels can contract a little bit, and the vessels have valves, so the lymph can move one direction but not the other direction. And then as you just move around, the contractions of your other muscles kind of squeeze that. So whereas, blood pressure is relatively high because you've got that strong heart and you've got muscles in the arteries and that, and so that helps to push blood all through your large body. The lymphatic system doesn't have hardly any pressure at all. It just kind of slowly it's moved back to your chest. And so we say it carries lymph. What is lymph? And there's probably a lot of things in lymph, but basically lymph is liquid that needs to be returned to the blood. And that's why it moves back to your chest and then gets put back into the blood, to the circulatory system. So where does it come from? Well, if you look in general throughout your whole body, blood moves throughout your body, right? And your blood is carrying things that your cells need: oxygen, nutrients, water. All your cells need these things. And so your blood is carrying that all throughout your body. And at some point, that blood's got to get out of the blood vessels and into the cells. And where that happens are in these beds of capillaries. And so you've got an artery that carries blood to the capillaries. Now, capillaries are very thin, very delicate. They're usually like one cell layer thick. And so they're a great place for diffusion and osmosis to take place. And so the blood gets pushed into these very tiny, fine, thin vessels, and stuff can diffuse out of the capillaries, and stuff can diffuse in, and water can move through osmosis in and out. And so you can exchange things then. These capillaries leak this fluid that bathes the cells, and then stuff gets into the cells, and then stuff comes out of the cells and then can get back into the capillaries and go into a vein, and that blood, the vein carries blood away from the capillaries, and now the blood has got waste products like carbon dioxide and waste from metabolism and things like that. And so that's how your cells get all the stuff they need and get rid of the stuff that they don't want. But simultaneously, well, first off, we made a big deal. We talked a lot about diffusion and osmosis. Well, right here, this is a spot where that becomes very important, right? How does that stuff get from the blood into the cells? There's a high concentration of oxygen in the blood, a low concentration in the cells. So the oxygen is going to diffuse into the cells. And maybe your cells are, very hypertonic. and the blood's bringing water. So now water can move through osmosis into the cells. And maybe there's lots of waste or CO2 in the cell and not much in the blood. So that's going to diffuse out into the blood. So those processes we talked about, well, this is where a lot of that occurs, right? But you've got all this interstitial liquid that's bathing the cells, and a lot of it goes into the lymphatic system, not back into the blood. And so once it gets back into the lymphatic system, now we call it lymph. And it's a lot like blood plasma. Blood plasma is like the liquid part of blood, right? And so lymph is just very similar to that. It's just this liquid, but now it's in the lymphatic vessels, so we call it lymph. And because, it's part of the immune system, it's got a lot of these leukocytes. It's got a lot of white blood cells in it. And so it helps to carry, part of the lymphatic system's purpose is to carry these leukocytes around the body. But the lymphatic system makes a lot of the important white blood cells. And the ones that are made in the lymphatic system are called lymphocytes. Now, it's very similar sounding words, so don't get confused here, right? Leukocytes is white blood cells, right? Lymphocyte is a type of leukocyte. There's all kinds of types of leukocytes, and lymphocytes are white blood cells that are made and mature in the lymphatic system. But other white blood cells can be made and mature in other parts of the body. Again, it's very complicated. There's a lot going on. We're not going to get into all those details. And these leukocytes and lymphocytes, they start in the bone marrow. And so that's where blood cells are made. Both red blood cells and white blood cells are produced in bone marrow. So inside of your bones is where you've got these what are known as stem cells. You've got these cells that could turn into any kind of blood cell, and it just sort of depends upon what the body needs. And so some of these white blood cells that are produced in the bone marrow, they mature in the bone marrow. And so they're created in the bone marrow, and then they stay in the bone marrow until they're ready to go. And so those are called B cells. And so maybe you've heard of that, B cells, beta cells, when talking about immunity. And the B is for bone marrow. Now, some of the lymphocytes are made in the bone marrow, but then they move to the thymus, and they mature in the thymus. And those are called T cells, T for thymus. And so, again, the T cells mature in the thymus, up here in your chest. The tonsils and the spleen and the lymph nodes, they all store lymphocytes. They all store white blood cells, and they also filter the lymph. And we talked about them filtering the lymph. And so, again, that's just part of their function, is to store these white blood cells. And so whenever you need them, then they can be immediately released. Okay. Another important concept that is critical to your immune system is the ability to differentiate self from non-self. Remember, we said that your immune system has to recognize a pathogen and then remove it. Well, how do you recognize a pathogen? You need a way to identify that there's a foreign object in your body. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. And so I'm going to link back to what I just said. I said the B cells and the T cells mature. But what am I talking about? Well, in big picture, I'm talking about, they need to be processed, and they need to go through some changes until they're ready to go and do their job. But what are those changes? What is so important for these cells to do? What they're doing is that they're learning to recognize self and differentiate self from non-self. And so these blood cells need to be able to recognize, oh, this cell belongs to that's one of our cells. Don't attack it. Oh, this cell's one of our cells. Don't attack it. Oh, this cell does not belong here. Attack it. Right? And so the maturity process, part of the maturity process is being able to learn these. But how? How do these cells recognize other cells? Well, let's tie it back to something else we've already learned, the cell membrane. Okay? We've talked about the cell membrane a lot now. And it's basically a phospholipid bilayer. It's phospholipids in 2 layers, and all cells have this membrane, right? And so your cells have this membrane, and the pathogen cells have this membrane. But it's not just a phospholipid bilayer. It's more complicated than that. It's got lots of stuff stuck in that phospholipid bilayer. Lots of proteins embedded in that phospholipid bilayer. And it's these proteins, some of them are useful for identifying self versus non-self. So your immune system cells learn to recognize proteins from your body, and then consequently, if they don't recognize a protein, it must be from a different body, and that's something that must be attacked. And we could talk a lot about these types of proteins, but we're not going to get into too many details. Here's a figure from your textbook showing you, again, this idea. You can see the phospholipid bilayer, and then you can see proteins stuck in it. And some proteins go all the way through the bilayer, and some are stuck to the inside of the bilayer, and some are stuck to the outside of the bilayer. And so you can see carbohydrate, you can see these proteins, and also sometimes they're what are called glycoproteins. It's a protein with a carbohydrate on it. These are important for recognizing self versus non-self. And here's another picture of a cell membrane. And you can see the phospholipid bilayer. You can see lots of proteins stuck in it. And some of those are used by your immune system to recognize your own cells. Now, those proteins on the cell surface of the pathogen, of the parasite that's infecting you, those proteins are called antigens. And so it's the antigen that, if something has an antigen on it, then that is not one of your cells, and your immune system recognizes it and attacks it. And detection of these antigens usually stimulates the immune system. And so your immune system starts creating more cells and starts activating cells, and there's tons of chemicals that get released, and tons of chemical reactions, and tons of things that all of a sudden start up, all which are designed to attack this new pathogen. And these antigens, maybe they're still on, it's a bacterium, and you just detect it while it's on the bacterium. And a lot of times, just the presence of this pathogen, they just, they die and they release proteins, and these proteins are just, these antigens are just floating around. Doesn't matter. Once your immune system starts to recognize these non-self proteins, that gets the immune system kicking into gear. And what's interesting is that tumor cells also produce antigens. And so we talked about tumors, we talked about cancer, but these cancerous cells, when they lose the ability to stop dividing and they start dividing uncontrollably, often they also produce new proteins on their surface that are different from your regular proteins. And so your immune system can recognize those antigens, can recognize these cells need to be attacked. And so your immune system can help attack tumors and stop them from spreading because it can recognize these tumors. So that's interesting too. And that's an area, an important area of research, like learning how to use your own immune system to attack tumors if you get cancer. And so it's all about recognizing these foreign proteins on the cell surface. And to call back to when we talked about proteins earlier, here's a picture I showed you again of an antibody protein that's perfectly shaped to bind to a protein from a flu virus. Well, this is what I'm talking about. That protein from the flu virus, that's an antigen. And so here's another way that your immune system recognizes antigens. And so the antibodies are, important proteins in the immune system. And proteins, it's all about shape, right? And you've got an antibody with just the right shape to match the shape of this antigen. That's important for the immune system response. So it's all about recognizing foreign proteins and being able to bind to those foreign proteins. That's very important to your immune system response. Okay, so that's our starting point. And in the next section, we're going to go into a little bit more detail about what exactly happens in your body. So, stay with me, and I'll see you in the next lecture. See ya.